Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. I think it's important every once in a while that some of us come out of Washington and talk to people in America, and I'm particularly happy to be here in Ashland. I come from a little town not far from here. Actually, it's a few hundred miles from here, called Bradford, Pennsylvania, which is a town about the size of Ashland, perhaps a little smaller, where we also have a very active Rotary Club, which was very instrumental in getting some of us involved in international affairs. They at one time sponsored essay contests on all sorts of international issues, and in our town it piqued a tremendous interest in the international area. So I'm very happy to have the Rotary Club with us today, and I welcome them. There are many things that one could talk about in a talk like this. The President has named me to be his representative on organizing the Global Economic Summit, and that is a process whereby prime ministers and presidents assign an individual to spend time organizing the annual meeting of heads of state where they consider how to manage and coordinate global economic affairs. We could talk about China, Eastern Europe, and a number of other issues. But from my point of view, with the exception of some of the macroeconomic imbalances, things are going reasonably well in the world economy today. In China, the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, there is a change for the better. People are looking more in the direction of market economics. In East Asia, things are going well. And as I look around the world, there are many things, when I compare them to the situation that we found when the Reagan administration started, where things look in good shape. I don't think I'll talk too much about these today, although I'd be very happy to respond to questions. But what I would like to talk about today is a part of the world where there are very deep-seated problems, and where I see, in the course of the next 4 or 5 years, big potential problems coming for us. And that is in the area where I've spent the last 3.5 years serving as the Organization of American States Ambassador, namely Latin America. Perhaps the best way to begin about how I see the problems in Latin America coming would be to describe part of a trip that Secretary Schultz and I took late last year. I remember vividly an afternoon in a boat traveling around the shoreline of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. This has to be one of the most beautiful sights in the world. They're magnificent beaches, they're striking hills, they're beautiful buildings, they're lovely people, sparkling waters, and after long sessions that we had the previous day with the finance and foreign ministry officials in Brasilia, this was a wonderfully relaxing afternoon. However, less than 24 hours later, the Secretary and I were in a motorcade driving from the airport in La Paz, Bolivia, to the capital, where we were to have discussions with the Bolivian officials on matters of the financial situation, debt, drugs, and other matters. And unbeknownst to us, on the hills above our motorcade, as we were driving in from the airport, there was a group of terrorists that were monitoring our every move. And as our motorcade passed a certain point in the road, they let the police go through first, and then they detonated a powerful charge of dynamite in the cars directly opposite us. And this charge blew one of the cars halfway across the road. It pulverized the windows, it flattened the tires, it blasted the sides of the other cars with shrapnel and gravel. Fortunately for us, all of the cars that were hit were heavily armored with a thick layer of bulletproof glass and steel between the bomb and the passengers, which included Mrs. Schultz. But the very next vehicle, which passed just a few yards behind, and I mean like 5 or 10 yards behind, was the one in which Assistant Secretary Redmond and I were traveling. It had no armor, it had no bulletproof glass. And had that bomb gone off less than 3 seconds later, all of us in that vehicle would have been killed or maimed. Now, bombs like that are frequent events in some of the countries of the Andes. And the violence there is growing worse, not better, as the years pass. Parts of Colombia and other countries are almost ungovernable as a consequence of guerrilla and drug violence. Peru faces an even more dangerous and complex situation. And the situation in Central America is well known to all of you. Over the course of the past decade, we have seen dictatorships replaced by democracies in country after country in the region. Until today, 90% of the people in Latin America live in democracies. The few exceptions to this are either in the process of democratizing themselves, such as Chile, or such conspicuous economic failures that they are not an attractive model for anyone. But the democracies themselves are facing serious difficulties. Many of them carry heavy debt burdens. All of them have serious economic problems of one sort or another, inflation being one common difficulty, cripplingly low rates of investment being another. But Latin America has always been an important export market for the United States, larger, in fact, than Japan or any country in Europe. So the economic health of Latin America is important to the United States, particularly at a time when we have a substantial and growing trade deficit. If Latin America grows and prospers, there will be more and better jobs in Detroit, Houston, and Ashland. If Latin America collapses into depression and anarchy, the impact in the United States will be immediate and profound. We will find ourselves with tens of millions of people seeking refuge in our country, and there will be a major security problem for us on our border. What needs to be done? It is first of all important to understand there are tremendous differences between the individual countries of Latin America, as my example of Rio and La Paz, Bolivia, was aimed at showing. There are today three separate but interrelated problems in Latin America: drugs, political violence, and insufficient economic growth. Let's talk about all three of these, beginning with Colombia and the drug problem as an example. Many Americans think that the governing elite of Colombia is indifferent to the death and suffering that their locally produced drugs is causing abroad. Nothing could be further from the truth. I have seen the anguish and frustration on the face of the foreign minister of Colombia when he was visiting the United States last year over perceptions in the United States that the Colombian government doesn't care about the drug problem. The truth is that the first victims of the drug lords in Colombia are millions of decent Colombians, including many government officials, who loathe and despise what the drug lords are doing, not only to American children, but also to the Colombian children in the tens of thousands. Why, you ask, don't they do something? Many have tried, including the late Attorney General of Colombia, Bonilla Lara, who was assassinated when he attempted to extradite some of the drug lords. His successor managed to survive repeated attempts on his life. Finally, his government sent him as ambassador to an Eastern European country, thinking he might be safe behind the Iron Curtain. But the drug killers merely traveled abroad and shot him down on the streets. However, this man not only survived horrible wounds, but immediately upon leaving the hospital, he traveled to the United Nations to denounce the drug lords and all their works. That, my friend, is courage, Colombian courage. Colombian judges face the same problem. One of my colleagues reported the case of one judge in Colombia. This judge was presiding over the trial of a local drug lord. The drug mafia first tried to bribe him with more money than that man will ever see again. He refused it. They then threatened to kill him. He increased his security and continued the trial. Then came the day when there arrived in his mail a letter with a photograph of his young daughter, taken as she was walking up the steps of her grade school, taken through the sights of a telescopic rifle, with the crosshairs on the back of her head. Well, you can imagine what that man went through, and after an agonizing night, he resigned his judgeship and returned to the private life. Colombian newspapers reported another judge recently received a letter from the Medellin cartel in the mail, threatening not just to kill her, but all the living members of her family. This remarkable woman sent the letter to the newspapers and persevered. She did this with the knowledge that the narco-terrorists have been known to execute all family members of those who cross them: grandparents, children, uncles, aunts, and everyone. They've even been known to step on the children's goldfish after assassinating all the people in a family. Several years ago, the drug lords in Colombia hired a group of local terrorists to attack the Supreme Court of the nation. Dozens of judges were slain in the attack, the first of whom were the judges presiding over the extradition cases against drug lords. This is the reality of the drug battlefield in Colombia. The unimaginable amounts of money in the hands of the drug people come from users in the United States, France, and elsewhere in the industrialized world. Until this flood of money into these evil hands is reduced, I am convinced that the drug problem in Colombia will continue to worsen and feed upon itself, despite the heroism of many brave and honest Colombian officials. And as the governing body of Colombia is weakened by the killings and corruption, other terrorist groups will attempt to profit by the situation by advancing their own position at the expense of the forces of law, order, and decency. I myself am convinced that we need to do all the things that the DEA and the U.S. police are currently doing in the war against drugs. But I'm also convinced that all the boats and helicopters in America will not be able to stop the flood of drugs into this country until we take further steps to increase the penalties against individual users. This measure, in combination with intensified public education on the danger of drugs, is what I personally think America needs to do to help the millions of decent Colombians now struggling to reclaim their country and their institutions from the evil influence of narco-terrorism, and also to protect our own children. I am equally convinced that failure to take steps of this nature against users and end the climate of relative permissiveness that exists in parts of our society toward drug users will result in ever-increasing violence and corruption, not just in Colombia, but also in the United States. We are also seeing in some of our cities gun battles between rival gangs on a scale that makes Al Capone look like a minor league operator, including the nation's capital. 2 years ago, there was an important meeting of justice ministers sponsored by the OAS to talk about drugs. Before this meeting, it used to be fashionable for some Latin Americans to say that the drug problem was America's problem, not theirs. But all that changed. Inevitably, the drug lords turned to local customers, including local children, and undermined local governments. Thus, the OAS speeches by the attorneys general of 28 different countries could be summarized in these 5 sentences. Today, all countries are drug users and producers. We are all victims. The problem is bigger than any one of us. We must work together if we are to prevail, and the hour is very late. As I said before, the biggest additional contribution that America needs to make to the war on drugs is, in my view, to increase penalties to the point where usage will be discouraged, particularly among beginners not fully addicted, and to intensify education to warn children about the dangers of drugs. And those dangers are very real. My little girl is only 7 years old. Last year, her school sent to all of us parents a circular warning them against little Mickey Mouse stickers that were impregnated with LSD that needed only to be placed on the back of a child's hand to transmit its mind-damaging drug. When I received this, I thought to myself, my God, how do you protect your children against Mickey Mouse stickers? But that is how drug dealers create new generations of customers for their evil trade. I think we have to take all of this very seriously, for the sake of our children and our grandchildren, for the sake of our institutions, and for the sake of governments elsewhere in the region. We cannot afford to take a casual or permissive attitude toward users in the United States, and this includes prominent drug users in the sports world, the entertainment industry, and otherwise, who provide role models for millions of impressionable youngsters. Beyond the devastating impact that permissive attitudes fosters, drug users provide literally billions of dollars to fuel an evil enterprise that threatens all of us, as parents, as grandparents, and as public officials. The second issue I wish to touch upon today concerns political violence and terrorism. Today, for example, Nicaragua, over the course of the last several years, has provided assistance to various kinds of terrorist groups from more than a dozen different countries in the region. This ranges from weapons for guerrillas in neighboring El Salvador to training and refuge for guerrilla leaders to other countries. This has been going on since 1980 and was a principal reason why the administration's Contra program was organized. At present, the small countries involved do not pose a direct threat to the United States, regardless of how committed some of the guerrilla leaders may be. The real danger is a longer-term problem. It involves the possibility that political violence could eventually spread to Mexico, which has a long common border with the United States, and elsewhere in the region. Large-scale political violence in Mexico, for example, would trigger a massive capital flight, followed by massive unemployment, followed by more violence, followed by the flights of millions of desperate Mexican families seeking safety and jobs in the United States. Political stability is the first requirement for economic growth. Beyond that, the United States has a tremendous interest in keeping political violence as far away as possible from our country, Mexico, and our other Latin American allies. That is why we have reacted with such concern to efforts by the Sandinistas in Nicaragua to send weapons and trained personnel to neighboring El Salvador, and why we have taken their public threat to spread revolution and violence throughout Central America with the utmost seriousness. The United States learned in the 1930s the importance of collective security and alliance structures. It is a lesson that remains valid. Guerrilla groups are today active to a greater or lesser degree in Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and elsewhere. 10 years ago, such groups came close to bringing down the governments of both Argentina and Uruguay and led to a period of military rule after the democracies collapsed under the terrorist onslaught. This could happen again elsewhere. These guerrilla groups must be taken seriously and dealt with when they are as small as possible. Once they grow, spread, and intensify, they become much more expensive and complicated to contain and overcome. There are various valid strategies for dealing with problems of this kind, and there are debates among well-meaning Americans as to the best strategy under individual circumstances. It is important to understand that the individual circumstances facing each one of these countries are very different. But there is one strategy that cannot work, and that is to ignore the problems in the hope that they will somehow go away by themselves. That is the road to disaster, first for our neighboring democracies to the south, and ultimately for us. Finally, a word about a third subject: how to increase sustained economic growth in Latin America. Since I previously served as Assistant Secretary of State for Economics and Business in the previous administration, when the strategy for coping with the third world debt problem was devised, I have followed with great interest how countries have worked to deal with their economic problems, including the debt burden. Chile, of course, has been the most successful in reorganizing its economy, reducing the size of its debt, and getting economic growth back on a sustained basis. Chile's success shows that it is possible to develop non-traditional new export industries and products and develop innovative debt for equity swaps. Chile is also not a democracy and had the luxury of surviving a disastrous economic mistake in the early 1980s when it tried to peg its currency to the dollar with catastrophic consequences. But Chile turned things around, and today Chile's economic growth is the envy of the rest of Latin America. Brazil was also very successful in greatly increasing its exports to service its debts. But then came a period of elections during which the government applied excessive monetary stimulus on top of price controls. It created a dramatic boom, and weeks after the election, an equally dramatic bust as the controls were lifted and the natural forces of supply and demand reestablished equilibrium at far lower levels. The people of Brazil felt cheated by their leadership, and Brazil's government has not yet recovered from the popular disillusionment that occurred. Brazil is not unique. One of the things that the Secretary and I noticed on our trip through the region was that by and large, finance and economic ministers today know what they need to do to create long-term economic health in their individual countries. The problem is that the people and the politics in those countries are moving away from sound economic and financial ministry thinking. Additional center-left governments appear very likely in a number of important countries in the coming year or two, and some politicians are raising expectations among the electorate that will be very hard to satisfy. Many of these countries already have inflations, the size of which the United States mercifully has never experienced. In Brazil, at one point it approached 1,000% per year. In Argentina, it's now 40% per month. It is also, if new governments attempt to increase welfare and social benefits on top of inflations of this kind, the results will be economic and eventual political chaos. We need urgently to work with these new leaders to persuade them to follow successful economic models that have already proven their worth when they have been tried elsewhere. If together we succeed, democracies will continue. And if we fail, a return to the military governments of the 1960s and 70s, or worse, in some places, is very likely indeed. But the pressures on Latin American politicians are great. Austerity measures that falling oil prices and debt service charges forced upon the Mexican people have reduced real wages in that country by as much as 50% since 1980. Imagine what that means for individual Mexican families. It came as no surprise to me that under these circumstances, the ruling political party in Mexico, the PRI, came under increasing criticism and challenge. The problem is that the political challenges to Latin American democracies come mainly from the left. And there is no economic answer in left-wing economics. The only answer is a long-term one involving increasing rates of investment, decreasing inflation through stable monetary policies, open world trade regimes, and reducing terrorist problems that trigger fear and capital flight. Managing an economy is not an easy task. Everything must be done right to achieve sustained economic growth. Failure to provide all the conditions necessary for increased investment and long-term growth drives capital elsewhere where these conditions do exist. Asia is a place where many of these favorable conditions exist, and it is not surprising that that's where we have seen much economic growth in the course of the past 25 years. Latin America must compete with Asia to attract investment capital. Fortunately, many countries in Latin America do have comparative advantages that potentially can make them comparative in bidding for available world investment capital. But more must be done in most countries in this competitive bidding process. In this, we can be somewhat helpful. Strengthening the Inter-American Development Bank under the right circumstances, which we have recently agreed to do, can play a positive role. We may also be able to suggest ways of helping other countries convert more of their debt to equity along the lines of what Chile has successfully done. And that is one of the things that the Brady Initiative on debt is scheduled to do. I am in favor of avoiding protectionist legislation, which could unleash economic and political catastrophe in Latin America and elsewhere. But in the final analysis, the main task of making Latin American economies work lies on the shoulders of Latin Americans themselves. If they practice stop-and-go economics with artificial stimulus prior to elections and massive hangovers afterwards, if they elect demagogues and inexperienced individuals who promise unrealistic benefits to all, if they turn a blind eye to the terrorist problems of their neighbors, then our assistance will be insufficient to avert major problems. But if we can work together, educate each other, support each other, and plan realistically, there is no theoretical reason whatsoever why many Latin American countries cannot become the economic success stories of the next 25 years, just as East Asia, for the past quarter of a century, was the economic success story. Brazil, for example, is a world power in the making, and in some respects is where the United States was about 1900. Shortly before he died, my old friend and colleague, Arthur Burns, dropped in to visit me. And in the course of his conversation, he mentioned that if he were a young man today, he would go to Brazil to make his fortune. He saw Brazil as a major world power in the 21st century. So do I. In conclusion, let me say that the world has remarkably improved in the past several years. Bloody wars are coming to an end in a number of places. Our relations with the Soviet Union are now better, and a number of agreements have been signed or are in prospect. Europe and East Asia are generally healthy and stable places, and as a general rule, the world picture looks pretty good. Parts of Latin America are an exception to this rule, and there is a lot of potential instability, either bubbling up to the surface or lurking just beneath it. We would do well to pay more attention to these problems now, because if we do not, these problems will impose themselves on us forcefully in the coming decade. Our first task is to help educate our own people about the problems threatening the region. The poll data confirms the most shocking lack of information about the great region south of the Rio Grande and its many afflictions. This lack of public information will doom any meaningful effort to assist in the problems facing Latin America. In a democracy, the people decide on the allocation of resources. If the debate is confined to a small elite on the right and center, opposed by an equally small but highly motivated elite on the left, it simply guarantees policy stalemate. And we cannot afford for this stalemate to continue. Together, we face in this hemisphere major challenges in dealing with drugs, political violence, and economic growth. The one strategy that will not work is to ignore these problems, hoping they will go away by themselves. They will not. What is now required both in North and South America is greater realism, more resources applied to the problems, and firm resolution to master the challenges we face. Thank you very much.